What if I told you that a plane crash, high in the freezing heart of the Andes, didn't end in tragedy, but in one of the greatest miracles of survival the world has ever seen? What if I told you that to stay alive, they had to make a choice no human should ever face? Today, we're diving into the unspeakable, uncovering the truth behind Flight 571, the crash that changed the definition of survival forever. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 was supposed to be a routine journey, carrying 45 passengers, including a rugby team, their friends, and family, from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile. But fate had other plans. On October 13, 1972, as the plane entered the treacherous peaks of the Andes Mountains, something went catastrophically wrong. The radio contact broke. The plane vanished. The world assumed they were dead. But what happened next would shock the entire world. The survivors awoke in a world of white, snow blinding their eyes, the cold cutting through their bones, and silence echoing where engines once roared. They had no food, no warmth, and no sign of rescue. The wreckage became their shelter, the mountains their prison. Days turned into weeks. Hope turned into agony. And then, as hunger clawed at their souls, they faced an unthinkable decision: to survive. They would have to cross a moral line that no one ever should. When the world learned what the survivors endured, it didn't just become a story of horror. It became a story of humanity's will to live. 16 men emerged from the mountains after 72 days, not as victims, but as living symbols of endurance, courage, and faith. Flight 571 became more than a tragedy. It became a testament to the power of hope when all else is lost. October 13, 1972. It began like any other day. A flight, a team, a dream. 45 souls boarded Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a Fairchild FH-27 twin-engine plane, bound for Santiago, Chile. They were young men, full of spirit, members of the Old Christians Rugby Club. They were traveling to face their rivals in what was supposed to be a friendly match. Their laughter filled the cabin, their energy contagious. The sky was clear as they took off from Montevideo, carrying with them not just luggage and gear, but hope. And a future none of them could imagine would be stolen away within hours. As the plane climbed, slicing through clouds and drifting toward the Andes, the passengers settled into comfort. Someone cracked a joke, another shared a sandwich. They had no idea that fate was slowly turning its gaze upon them. The pilot, Colonel Julio Ferradas, was an experienced man, a veteran of the skies. By his side was co-pilot Lieutenant Dante Lagarara. Their route should have been simple: fly west across Argentina, then turn south to Chile. But that day, the Andes Mountains, tall and merciless, stood like an ancient wall between two nations. Weather conditions shifted, and clouds began to rise, thick and heavy, swallowing the horizon. Inside the cockpit, visibility worsened. Instruments blinked uncertainly. Still, the men trusted their skills. They believed they had crossed the most dangerous part of the mountain range, but in truth, they hadn't. They were flying too far north. The maps deceived them. The instruments betrayed them. And when Ferradas radioed to air traffic control that they had cleared the Andes and were ready to descend into Chile, he was wrong. Deadly wrong. They began their descent into what they thought was the Chilean valley. But instead, they were dropping into the unforgiving peaks of the Andes themselves. Jagged ice and rock rose to meet them like 1,000 blades pointed to the sky. Suddenly, the plane's tail clipped a ridge. The right wing tore away in an explosion of metal and snow. Screams filled the cabin as the fuselage ripped apart, spinning violently. The engine screamed, then died. The world outside became a blur of white and terror. The aircraft slammed into a glacier at more than 300 kilometers per hour. The front section disintegrated, the rear half breaking apart like paper. Bodies hurled against walls, seats torn from their frames. Snow poured in through shattered windows. In seconds, a lively plane became a broken coffin in the middle of nowhere. When the silence finally fell, it was not peace. It was the silence of death. Only 33 of the 45 passengers were still alive. Some barely. Others were screaming in pain, trapped under twisted metal and snow. The cold wind roared through the cracks of the wreckage, stealing warmth from their bodies with every breath. The survivors looked around in shock. Their friends, their teammates, were gone. The captain, the co-pilot, many of the passengers had been crushed or thrown from the plane entirely. The smell of fuel mixed with blood. The snow beneath them turned pink. But somehow, among the wreckage, life clung stubbornly on. Hours passed, then night fell. The temperature plunged below freezing. There was no light, no fire, and no hope of rescue. The only thing they could see was the pale reflection of the moon on the snow, and the haunting outline of the mountains, the very mountains that had swallowed them whole. Inside, what was left of the fuselage? The survivors huddled together for warmth. They wrapped themselves in seat covers, clothes, and each other's arms. They prayed. Some cried. Some refused to believe it was real. They thought maybe tomorrow we'll be found. Maybe someone saw us crash. Maybe there's a rescue team already on the way. But the world below had no idea where they were. The crash site was so deep in the Andes that even radar lost track of them. The plane's emergency beacon was destroyed on impact. The coordinates reported before descent were wrong. Search parties were scouring the wrong areas, hundreds of miles away. The survivors of Flight 571 were ghosts in the mountains, lost to the world. Invisible beneath a sea of snow. Days began to blend together. Their food supply was minimal: a few chocolate bars, a bottle of wine, some peanuts. They rationed every crumb, every drop. They melted snow for water. They tried to believe rescue would come. But the days stretched into weeks, and the skies above remained empty. Then came the cruelest blow of all. On the 11th day, a small radio, salvaged from the cockpit, crackled to life. They gathered around it, desperate for a sign, a name, a miracle. But what they heard instead shattered them completely. The announcer's voice on the radio said that the search for Flight 571 had been called off. All passengers and crew were presumed dead. Imagine that moment. You are stranded in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. No food, no fire, no rescue. And now you learn that the world has given up on you. That no one is coming. That your story has already ended in the eyes of the living. Some broke down in tears. Some stared blankly into space. Others began to pray harder. But a few refused to accept it. Among them was Nando Parado, a 22-year-old rugby player. He had lost his mother and sister in the crash. He had been unconscious for 3 days, his skull fractured. When he awoke, he found himself in a nightmare that had no dawn. But instead of surrendering, something inside him changed. He looked around at the faces of his teammates, the frostbite creeping up their fingers, the despair setting in, and he made a silent vow: they would not die here. Not like this. Outside, the Andes stretched endlessly, white and silent. Inside the wreckage, breath turned to fog, and hope flickered like the faintest candle flame in a storm. They didn't yet know the horrors that awaited them, the decisions they would soon have to make, decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. For now, they clung to one thought: that maybe, somehow they could outlast the mountain. But the mountain was patient. The mountain did not forgive. And the mountain was just getting started. The morning after the crash came like a cruel trick of nature. The sun rose, not to bring warmth, but to blind them with its reflection off endless white. When they opened their eyes, it wasn't a dream. The wreckage was still there. The silence was still there. And the world was still gone. They were surrounded by mountains so vast and ancient they seemed to swallow the sky. The peaks towered like stone giants, their icy breath cutting through every layer of clothing. The wind never stopped. It whispered through the broken fuselage like a voice that wouldn't die. Inside that metal tomb, 33 people clung to life. Their world had shrunk to the length of a shattered airplane. The seats had become beds. The insulation torn from the walls had become blankets. Their home was a coffin, half buried in snow, and every day, it sank deeper into the cold. Days turned to nights, nights to endless suffering. They counted the hours not by clocks, but by hunger. Their stomachs cried louder than their voices. The few bits of chocolate and snacks they had were gone. They rationed every crumb, every sip of melted snow, praying for the sound of an approaching plane. And sometimes, they thought they heard one. The faint hum of an engine would echo through the mountains. They'd rush outside, waving pieces of metal, screaming with all their strength. But each time the sound faded, only wind against rock. False hope. Cruel hope. Then came the avalanche. It was night when it struck. Sudden, merciless. The snow roared down the mountain like an animal unleashed. In seconds, the wreckage was buried, suffocating the survivors inside. Panic erupted in the darkness as they screamed, gasped for air, clawed at the snow pressing down on their faces. Some never woke up. When it stopped, 8 more were dead. Their tiny shelter had become a tomb once again. The survivors dug through layers of ice with their bare hands, pulling out bodies frozen in the positions they'd died. There was no time to mourn, no strength left to cry. Death had become a part of the air they breathed. The food was gone, the radio still silent, and the mountains remained indifferent. Days blurred. They talked less and less. Their lips cracked. Their skin turned blue. Some lost their will, lying quietly as if waiting for death to take them gently. Others whispered prayers, hoping God still listened at this altitude. Then came the moment that would define them forever, when hunger grows beyond pain. Beyond thought, something inside the human mind begins to change. Instinct takes over. Survival becomes the only voice left. And one night that voice spoke the unthinkable. What if they could eat to live? But there was no food. No plants, no animals. Just snow, and the bodies of their friends. At first, no one said it aloud. The idea was a shadow that passed silently among them, too monstrous to face. They tried to push it away, to find another way. But there was none. The cold would not feed them. The snow could not fill their stomachs. They were dying. And then, someone whispered the words that had been hiding in their hearts. We must do what is necessary. No one wanted to be the first. No one wanted to believe they could cross such a line. But as more days passed, their faces grew hollow, their eyes dim. Their bodies were shutting down. And one by one, they began to accept the truth. If they did nothing, they would all die. If they acted, some might live. So, with tears in their eyes and trembling hands, they made the choice. A choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They used shards of glass and pieces of metal to cut small portions from the frozen bodies of those who had died. They whispered prayers over each piece. They thanked them. They asked for forgiveness. This was not cruelty. This was not madness. This was survival. And in that moment, something ancient awoke in them, the primal will to live at any cost. But even as they forced themselves to do what they must, shame burned in their hearts. Some refused to eat, choosing death over the act. Others wept as they took their first bite. It wasn't hunger that drove them. It was the desperate will to see another sunrise. Days turned into weeks again. Some died despite it all, frostbite, infection, exhaustion. But some grew stronger. They began to adapt. They learned to melt snow more efficiently, to patch holes in the fuselage with metal scraps, to create makeshift beds and keep a constant watch for rescue planes. And sometimes, when the wind was calm, they'd talk about life after the mountains, about their families, their dreams, their hopes, as if speaking of the world beyond could keep them human. But the Andes had no mercy. The cold deepened. Their bodies weakened. The snow buried the wreckage deeper each day. And rescue never came. 2 months had passed. 2 months of death, hunger, and silence. 2 months since the world had declared them gone. But still, they breathed. Still they lived. And somewhere deep inside that frozen hell, a spark of defiance refused to die. They began to believe that if rescue wouldn't come to them, they would have to go find it themselves. It was Nando Parrado who first voiced it. His eyes no longer filled with despair, but with fire. He turned to his teammates, men who had lost everything, and said quietly, "If we stay here, we die. But if we go, maybe we live." No one answered at first. The idea seemed impossible. Outside those walls was nothing but snow, mountains, and death. But slowly, heads began to nod. Because impossibility was all they had left, they began to plan a trek across the mountains with no map, no compass, no supplies. Just faith. Just hope. And as they prepared for that final gamble against nature itself, they did not know that they were about to write one of the most extraordinary chapters of survival in human history. The frozen mountains had taken everything from them. Warmth, comfort, friends, family. But it could not take their will. And soon, that will would rise from the snow and begin an impossible journey through the heart of the Andes. By December 1972, the survivors of Flight 571 had been trapped in the Andes for nearly 2 months. The snow had swallowed their world. The wind had become their only companion, and hope had become a memory that flickered faintly in their hearts. But among them, 2 men refused to let that flicker die: Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa. Nando was the kind of man who had already faced death and looked it in the eyes. He'd lost his mother in the crash. His sister had died days later, her last breath slipping away in his arms. For a long time, he had nothing left to live for. But something inside him, something that no mountain could freeze, began to awaken. It was not just survival anymore. It was a promise. A promise that their story would not end buried beneath the snow. Roberto was different, calm, rational, a medical student with a steady mind. But even he knew logic had no place here. This was not a battle of reason, it was a war of will. And so, together, they decided to do the unthinkable. They would leave. They would climb the mountains that had caged them and walk through the impossible, to find life again. When Nando first said it aloud, the others looked at him like he had lost his mind. The nearest sign of civilization was over 50 miles away, across some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. They had no map, no compass, no radio, no proper clothing. Just scraps of metal, bits of insulation, and courage born from desperation. But Nando didn't waver. "If we stay," he said, "we die here. If we go, maybe we live." And with those words, the impossible began. They spent days preparing. From the remains of the plane, they tore apart insulation to use as sleeping bags. They fashioned boots out of seat covers. They melted metal to make sunglasses that would protect their eyes from snow blindness. They gathered what little food they had left, the last remnants of flesh from those who had perished, and packed it tightly. There was no room for fear now. Fear was a luxury of the living. On December 12, 1972, as the wind screamed across the Andes, Nando, Roberto, and another survivor, Antonio Tintin Vizintin, stepped out into the blinding white. Behind them, the others watched in silence. It was like watching ghosts walk into the afterlife. For the first time in 60 days, they left the comfort of their prison. Each step sank into snow up to their knees. Each breath burned their lungs. The altitude stole the air from their chests. But still they moved. Because standing still meant death, the mountains rose around them like living giants. Peaks towered so high they seemed to pierce the heavens. The cold bit into their flesh, but they didn't stop. For 3 days they climbed. The higher they went, the harder the air became to breathe. The sun was merciless during the day, burning their faces, and the nights were a nightmare of ice. They wrapped themselves in what little insulation they had and huddled together, shaking uncontrollably until dawn, but nothing could have prepared them for what they saw when they reached the top of the first ridge. They thought that beyond this mountain lay the green valleys of Chile, safety, warmth, life. But when they finally looked out from the summit, all they saw was more mountains. Endless, merciless mountains, stretching as far as the eye could see. It broke them. Antonio fell to his knees crying, "We'll never make it. We'll never get out." But Nando didn't fall. He stared at the horizon, his face blank, his heart refusing to surrender. "No," he said quietly. "Somewhere out there must be life." They rested for a night. The next morning, Nando made the hardest decision of his life. They didn't have enough food for all three to continue. Someone had to return to the fuselage to tell the others they were still trying, still fighting. Antonio volunteered to go back. So now it was just Nando and Roberto, 2 men against the Andes. They continued their journey, walking through valleys of ice and ridges that looked like broken teeth. The sun blistered their faces. Their lips cracked and bled. The snow underfoot hid crevices deep enough to swallow them whole. At night, they slept huddled together, shivering under makeshift sleeping bags made of foil and fabric, their breath forming clouds in the dark. Every step felt like walking through eternity. But each morning, they rose again, because stopping wasn't an option. On the 7th day, they reached a new peak, one that towered even higher than before. Nando climbed it with every ounce of strength left in his body. He said later that he could feel his mother's spirit pushing him forward, whispering in the wind. And when he finally reached the top, what he saw made him fall to his knees and weep, for the first time. He saw a green dot. It wasn't much, just the faint color of the valleys below, far beyond the snow. But to Nando and Roberto, it was heaven. Proof that life existed beyond this frozen hell. Fueled by that vision, they pressed on for 3 more days. Their bodies were broken, their feet raw, but their souls burned brighter than ever. And then, on the 10th day, they saw it. A river. Flowing water, grass, birds, signs of life. They collapsed beside the riverbank, too weak to move, too exhausted to cry. For the first time in over 2 months, they were surrounded not by snow, but by earth. They had done the impossible. But their struggle wasn't over yet. They needed to find people, fast. On the other side of the river, far in the distance, they spotted a man on horseback. They screamed, waved their arms, begged for help, but their voices were faint, lost in the roar of the river. The man looked at them, but he couldn't hear. He disappeared back into the hills. Desperation clawed at them. But the next day, he returned with more men. The Chilean muleteers, shepherds of the Andes, had seen them. They threw bread across the river, shouting that they would come back with help. That night, Nando and Roberto slept knowing they had finally been seen. Within hours, the Chilean authorities were alerted. Helicopters were dispatched. And for the first time since October, the silence of the Andes was broken by the sound of rescue. Nando guided the rescuers back through the deadly mountains to the crash site. It took 2 separate missions to bring everyone home. But in the end, after 72 days of snow, starvation, and death, 16 survivors emerged from the mountains. Their faces were hollow, their eyes haunted, but they were alive. The world called it the miracle of the Andes, but to Nando, Roberto, and the others, it wasn't a miracle. It was the will to live, stronger than the cold, stronger than despair, stronger than the mountain itself. For over 2 months, the story had been closed, a tragedy sealed in snow and silence. The Uruguayan Air Force had stopped searching weeks earlier. Families had mourned. Graves had been dug. Life had tried to move on, and then, a single call from Chile shattered that illusion. On December 22, 1972, helicopters cut through the thin air of the Andes once again. Below them, amid endless white, they saw movement, figures waving frantically near the twisted silver wreckage of a plane. Men who shouldn't have been alive. Men who had defied the mountain itself. The first rescuer to step out of the helicopter said the silence of that moment was heavier than the wind. The survivors didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They just stared, hollow eyes, cracked lips, skin burned from sun and frost. The rescuers couldn't believe what they were seeing. These were not just men. These were ghosts who had refused to die. When the world learned the details, shock turned into disbelief. And then horror. Yes, they had survived, but how? The newspapers called it the miracle of the Andes. But soon, whispers spread of cannibalism, of the unthinkable choices they had made to stay alive, of men forced to eat the flesh of their dead friends. The same people who had been hailed as miracles were suddenly branded as monsters by those who had never faced the edge of death. But when the survivors spoke, they spoke with humility, not shame. They didn't justify what they did. They didn't glorify it. They simply told the truth. They said it wasn't about hunger. It was about survival. It was about honoring the dead in the only way they could, by living. They prayed before every act. They thanked those who had died. They made a pact that if one fell, the others could use his body to live on. This was not savagery. This was humanity, stripped to its rawest form. The instinct to endure when everything else has been taken. As the survivors were airlifted to safety, their bodies weighed barely half of what they once did. Their eyes were deep, distant, holding memories no one could ever understand. Doctors wept when they saw them. Journalists struggled to find words that could capture the story. But the truth didn't lie in the headlines. It lay in their silence. Because behind that silence was everything they'd endured. The hunger, the cold, the death, the prayers whispered into the void. When Nando Parrado was finally reunited with his father, the old man broke down. He had already buried his wife and daughter. He had believed his son was gone too. And now, here he was, alive. Thin as bone, but alive. Nando held his father's hand and whispered, "I knew you would never stop waiting for me." That moment, father and son embracing after 72 days of hell, became the image that defined the entire story. It wasn't about the crash anymore. It wasn't about the horror. It was about the miracle of faith, faith in life itself. When the full rescue was completed, 16 men had survived. 16 souls who refused to surrender to the mountain. They were brought back to civilization, where crowds gathered to see them. Some treated them like heroes. Others avoided their eyes. Reporters shouted questions, demanding to know every detail. But no answer could ever satisfy those who hadn't been there. One survivor said, "You can't understand. You can never understand unless you've watched death sleep beside you every night." Over time, their story became something greater than survival. It became a mirror, showing the world what humanity truly is when stripped bare. We think we know ourselves. We think we know what we're capable of. But until we stand at the edge of the world, until the cold takes everything but our will, we don't really know how far the human spirit can go. Years later, Nando Parrado would write, "I am not a hero. I am an ordinary man who found himself in an extraordinary situation." And that's what makes the story of Flight 571 so haunting. It isn't just about tragedy. It's about transformation. The mountains didn't just test them, they remade them. They walked in as men of flesh and faith, and walked out as men of legend. Today, the site of the crash still lies in silence. Deep in the Andes, snow covers the remains of the fuselage. A small cross stands there, built by the survivors when they returned years later. It bears the names of those who never made it home. Every year they come back, the survivors, now older, their faces lined with time, to sit in the snow and talk to their friends. They laugh, they cry. They remember because they know that what happened there was not just a story of loss, but of connection between life and death, between man and mountain, between despair and faith. And when people ask them how they survived, they always say the same thing: that it wasn't strength, it wasn't luck. It was love, love for their families, love for their friends, love for the promise of another sunrise. That's what kept them alive. That's what pushed Mando and Roberto across the mountains. That's what gave them the courage to face the impossible. The story of Flight 571 isn't just about survival against all odds. It's about the miracle that lives inside all of us. The unbreakable force that whispers when the world goes silent. Don't give up, because sometimes miracles aren't sent from above. Sometimes miracles are the ones who climb out of the snow and keep walking. When the world first heard about Flight 571, they called it a tragedy. When they learned what those men endured, they called it a horror. But when they saw them walk out of the mountains, thin, trembling, but alive, they called it a miracle. The truth is, it was all three, because what happened in the Andes wasn't just the story of a plane crash. It was the story of what it means to be human, fragile, flawed, fearful, yet capable of rising above the impossible. Those mountains still stand today, frozen and silent, watching over the place where 45 souls once fell from the sky. The snow still hides the scars of that day, the twisted metal, the silent graves, the memories too heavy for words. But beneath that snow lies something eternal, the spirit of survival. The proof that even when the world turns its back, even when God seems silent, the human heart refuses to stop beating. We often think of miracles as light breaking through darkness. But the miracle of Flight 571 wasn't born in light. It was born in the cold, in hunger, in fear. It was born in the moments when men chose to keep moving, when every part of them screamed to stop. Nando Parrado once said, "I saw death, and I decided to live." Simple words, but they carry the weight of everything he endured. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that life isn't defined by the days when the sun shines, but by the nights we spend fighting the dark. By the moments when we're buried and still find a way to rise. Because survival isn't about luck. It's about love, for life, for family, for one more breath. The Andes tried to bury their story, but the world would remember it as one of the greatest testaments of endurance ever told. Not because of the crash, not because of the cold, but because 16 men walked out of the mountain carrying more than scars. They carried proof that the human spirit can endure even when the body cannot. Proof that hope can outlast despair. Proof that miracles don't always fall from the heavens. Sometimes they climb out of the snow dot. So when you hear the name Flight 571, don't think only of tragedy. Think of the mountain that took 45 and gave back 16. Think of courage in its purest form, the kind that isn't shouted, but whispered through chattering teeth in the dark. And remember this, the miracle of the Andes wasn't found in survival. It was found in the will to never stop believing that life, no matter how fragile, is worth fighting for.